In a family famed for its drama, one that produced a celebrated novelist, a communist crusader, and a powerful duchess, one of the 6 Mitford sisters cast a shadow so dark it redefined scandal. Her name was Diana. Blessed with an almost otherworldly beauty and a formidable intellect, she was the queen of 1920s high society. But her life's purpose would not be found in glittering ballrooms. Instead, she became the Fascist Mitford, a devoted follower of British fascist leader Oswald Mosley and a personal friend of Adolf Hitler. The writer Truman Capote, a connoisseur of society's darkest secrets, perfectly captured her unsettling allure when he observed, "Diana proves that swans can swim in political mud, and not just swim, but dive deep, embrace the mire, and emerge seemingly unblemished." This is the extraordinary, unsettling story of that swan. We will journey through a world of crumbling empires and rising dictators to explore how one of the most glamorous women of her age, armed with privilege and passion, embraced one of history's most toxic ideologies, a choice she refused to regret to her dying day. To understand Diana, we must first understand the crucible in which she was forged, the strange, isolated, and highly combustible world of the Mitford family. Diana was born in 1910, the third of 7 children, to David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Redesdale, and Sidney Bowles. To understand the Mitford children, one must first understand their parents, 2 figures so perfectly, almost comically, mismatched that they seem to have sprung from the pages of a novel. Her father, known to his children simply as Favre, was a towering figure of legendary eccentricity and explosive rage. Lord Redesdale was the quintessential English country squire, a man who despised foreigners, intellectuals, art, and basically anything that had happened since the Boer War. He was profoundly anti-intellectual, once boasting that he had only ever read one book in his life, Jack London's White Fang, and had found it so good he never felt the need to read another. His passions were hunting, shooting, and fishing. His primary mode of communication was shouting. He was famous for his violent yet often theatrical rages, known to chase his children across the Oxfordshire countryside with a shotgun for some minor infraction. He once threw a precious piece of his wife's jewelry out of a train window simply because he was in a bad mood. Yet, beneath the bluster and the bigotry, there was a strange, buried vulnerability. He was a man deeply scarred by war, having lost a lung in the Boer War and his beloved brother in the First World War. His anger was the clumsy armor of a man who felt the world he understood was vanishing before his very eyes. If Favre was the family's storm, his wife Sidney, or Muv, was its still cold center. Sidney Bowles was beautiful in an ethereal, detached way, and famously frugal, a trait that bordered on the absurd, given their class. She managed the grand households with an iron will but an almost total lack of emotional engagement. Affection was rarely, if ever, openly expressed. She was aloof, serene, and possessed a quiet, unyielding will that often subtly directed the family's chaos. While Favre raged, Mauve simply endured, her emotional distance creating a profound void at the heart of the family. The children were expected to be resilient, to entertain themselves, and above all, not to be a bother. Into this world of emotional austerity and explosive eccentricity, the 7 Mitford children were born. Nancy, the future novelist and acid-tongued wit; Pamela, the quiet countrywoman; Tom, the only son, handsome and adored; Diana, the beauty, unity, the obsessive and tragic idealist; Jessica, the rebellious communist known as Decca; and Deborah, the youngest, Debo, who would become the Duchess of Devonshire. Their upbringing at Asthall Manor and later Swinbrook House in Oxfordshire was a mixture of privilege and neglect. Formal education for the girls was deemed entirely unnecessary by Favre. A governess taught them the basics, but for the most part, they were left to their own devices in their freezing cold, rambling country houses. This benign neglect, however, became the unlikely incubator of their formidable personalities. They became voracious readers, educating themselves in their father's library. They developed their own private language, boodle-didge, a mishmash of private words and inside jokes. They had their own sacred space, the Hon's cupboard, a linen cupboard at Asthall where they would gather to plot, gossip, and escape the adult world. This isolation fostered an intensely close, almost tribal bond between the sisters, but it was a bond forged in a crucible of constant competition and teasing. They were merciless with each other, honing their wit like a weapon. This strange, isolated upbringing produced a unique Mitford character. Fiercely independent, intellectually curious, utterly fearless of public opinion, and possessed of a powerful, almost unnerving, self-belief. They were raised to believe that their own opinions were the only ones that mattered, a trait that would lead them to both greatness and disaster. The world outside the Mitford bubble was in a state of profound shock and transformation. The cataclysm of the First World War had shattered the old certainties of the Edwardian era. An entire generation of young men, the future leaders of the aristocracy in the nation, had been wiped out in the trenches of France and Belgium. This colossal loss left a deep psychological scar on the nation, particularly on the upper classes, creating a pervasive sense of disillusionment, a feeling that the old ways, the old values, the old men who had led them into the slaughter had failed utterly. This disillusionment gave rise to the frantic, hedonistic culture of the 1920s, the era of the bright young things. It was a generation determined to dance on the ruins of the old world. Society was a whirlwind of jazz clubs, cocktail parties, and elaborate headline-grabbing stunts like the mock wedding of two society beauties. It was a world of determined frivolity, an attempt to outrun the ghosts of the war. Diana, upon her coming out into society, became a leading light of this set. Her classical beauty and cool intelligence made her a queen of the scene. But for many, the parties and the pleasure-seeking were not enough. The post-war world was grappling with immense problems: economic depression, mass unemployment, and the terrifying rise of new radical political ideologies. From the ashes of the old empires, two powerful and seductive ideas were rising, promising total solutions to the world's chaos: communism and fascism. These were not just political theories. They were all-encompassing belief systems, secular religions that offered a sense of purpose, belonging, and moral certainty to a generation that felt it had lost its way. For the Mitford sisters, isolated in their country houses and armed with their fierce intelligence and lack of formal education, these grand sweeping ideologies were irresistible. They were not content to be passive debutantes. They wanted to engage with the great ideas of their time, to take a stand, to matter. And so the Hans cupboard became a political battlefield. Nancy and Pamela remained largely traditional conservatives, but the younger girls plunged headfirst into the era's political extremes. Decca, the rebel, became a passionate communist, eventually running away to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And two of the sisters, Unity and Diana, would be drawn to the dark, magnetic allure of the opposite pole, fascism. Even among her remarkable sisters, Diana stood out from an early age. She possessed a beauty so perfect and so serene, it seemed almost otherworldly. The writer, Evelyn Waugh, a lifelong friend, was utterly captivated, describing her face as the veritable school of Hellas. But to mistake her for just a pretty face was a dangerous miscalculation. Beneath the ethereal exterior lay a mind as sharp as a razor and a will of iron. While her sisters devoured novels, Diana, in her self-education, consumed history, philosophy, and political biography. She developed a sophisticated understanding of European politics that was highly unusual for a young woman of her class and time. This combination of staggering beauty and formidable intellect was her defining characteristic. She was a woman who could not only turn every head in a ballroom, but could also hold her own in a debate with the sharpest political minds of the day. Her first act on the world stage was, however, deceptively conventional. At just 18, she made what seemed like the most perfect match imaginable, marrying Brian Guinness. An heir to the vast Guinness brewing fortune, Brian was handsome, charming, romantic, and staggeringly wealthy. Their wedding in 1929 was the society event of the year, a dazzling affair that seemed to promise a life of uninterrupted luxury, comfort, and perfect, respectable happiness. They moved into a magnificent house in Westminster, and their life became a whirlwind of artistic and social gatherings. Their home became a leading salon, a magnet for the intellectual and creative elite of the day. Guests included the Bloomsbury Group figure Lytton Strachey, the future poet laureate John Betjeman, and Evelyn Waugh, who would satirize their glittering world in his novel Vile Bodies. Diana was a dazzling hostess, her wit and intelligence shining brightly among these formidable minds. She had 2 sons with Brian, Jonathan, and Desmond. To all appearances, she had achieved the perfect aristocratic life. She was a beautiful, wealthy young mother, married to a kind and adoring husband at the very center of London's cultural life. She was, by all accounts, a perfect swan. But beneath the surface of this perfect life, a profound and dangerous dissatisfaction was growing. This was not the idle ennui of a bored housewife, but the existential frustration of a powerful intellect trapped in a world she found trivial. The endless parties, the witty but weightless conversations, the gentle but uninspiring love of her husband, it all felt hollow. As she later admitted, she was terribly, terribly bored. Diana craved a cause, a belief system with the power to transform a decaying world, a leader who could match her own intensity. She was a convert in search of a faith. She craved a cause, a belief system with the power to transform a decaying world, a leader who could match her own intensity. She was a believer in search of faith. And then, in 1932, at a dinner party in London, she met the man who would give her that faith and at the same time shatter her perfect world. That man was Sir Oswald Mosley. To understand the seismic impact he had on Diana, and indeed on British politics, you have to understand who he was before he became an outcast. He was not a marginal lunatic screaming on a street corner. He was a giant, a political prodigy who many in the political world predicted would one day become prime minister. He was an aristocrat, a baronet, a wealthy landowner, and a decorated war hero of the Royal Air Force. He entered Parliament as its youngest member of Parliament, initially as a conservative, before switching to stand as an independent, and then joining the Labour Party, where he rose to become a cabinet minister. He was a man of phenomenal energy and a brilliant original mind. His defining political passion was tackling the scourge of mass unemployment that was crippling Britain during the Great Depression. He believed the old parties, with their slow, timid, dogmatic approaches, were utterly failing the nation. He proposed radical modern solutions, advocating for massive government spending on public works and state intervention to manage the economy, ideas that were decades ahead of their time. But his colleagues in the Labour government found his plans too radical and his personality too arrogant. Frustrated and impatient, he resigned from the government in 1930 convinced that the entire British political system was broken and needed to be swept away. This was the man Diana met, not yet the reviled fascist, but a political renegade of immense stature, a man burning with a messianic self-belief and a coherent, powerful vision for national rebirth. And he was, by all accounts, a figure of almost hypnotic personal magnetism. He was handsome, a phenomenal orator who could hold crowds of thousands spellbound, and he exuded an aura of power and certainty that was intoxicating. For Diana, a woman starved of purpose, he was the answer to an unspoken prayer. The connection was instant and electric. He engaged with her not as a beautiful ornament, but as a serious intellectual equal. He saw in her not just a prize to be won, but a mind to be converted. He spoke of his vision for a new Britain, a corporate state where class conflict would be replaced by national unity, where action would replace endless debate, where strength and discipline would forge a modern, powerful nation. To Diana, listening to him was, she said, like a trumpet call. He offered her everything she lacked, a cause, an ideology, and a sense of participating in history, not just observing it from a drawing room window. She fell completely and irrevocably under his spell. The affair between Diana Guinness and Oswald Mosley became the great scandal of the age. It was not a discreet, hidden liaison. It was a flagrant public romance that ripped through the heart of the British establishment. Mosley was, at the time, married to Lady Cynthia Curzon, or Simi, the daughter of the former Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon. Simi was a beloved figure, a fellow politician in her own right, and she had borne him 3 children. But Mosley was a compulsive womanizer, and his marriage was already strained by his countless infidelities, which included an affair with Simi's own stepmother. Diana, however, was different. She was not just another dalliance. She was his intellectual and spiritual soulmate. She offered him not just her beauty and her devotion, but her formidable mind and her Guinness fortune. She became a central figure in his new political movement, the British Union of Fascists, which he founded in 1932. She attended meetings, edited the party's newspapers, and acted as his closest confidant and strategist. She was his partner in every sense of the word, long before she became his wife. The social consequences were immediate and catastrophic. For an aristocratic lady to leave her wealthy, respectable husband and 2 young sons for a married man was shocking enough. But for that man to be Oswald Mosley, the leader of a new extremist political movement that courted violence and was modeled on Mussolini's Italy, was beyond the pale. The doors of London society, which had once flown open for her, now slammed shut. She was branded a homewrecker and a political radical. Her own family was torn apart. Her gentle husband, Brian Guinness, was left utterly devastated, unable to comprehend the transformation of the woman he loved. Her parents were apoplectic. Her father, Favre, who despised everything Mosley stood for, threatened to disinherit her and refused to be in the same room as her. Her mother, Muv, who was a close friend of Simi's family, took their side, refusing to see or speak to Diana for years. Even her sisters were divided. The scandal created a schism in the famously close-knit family that would never fully heal. But Diana was impervious. Her loyalty, once given, was absolute. She seemed to thrive on the condemnation, viewing it as proof of the cowardice and hypocrisy of the establishment she so despised. Her conviction in Mosley's vision was total. She believed in him utterly, not just as a lover, but as the political savior of her country. She willingly sacrificed her reputation, her social standing, and her family relationships for him and for his cause. The pain of the ostracism was real, but in her mind, it was the necessary price of a higher calling. In May 1933, A tragic event altered the course of their lives. Mosley's wife, Simi, died suddenly of peritonitis. The path was now clear for Diana and Mosley to marry. But Mosley, in a complex display of public grief and private callousness, plunged into a series of frantic affairs, including one with Simi's younger sister, and postponed any talk of marriage. Diana waited, her loyalty unwavering, continuing to serve as his political partner and hostess, while he mourned his late wife in his own chaotic fashion. To understand Diana's commitment, we must look at the movement she embraced. The British Union of Fascists was, in its early days, a dynamic and to some appealing force. It promised to end unemployment, to crush communism, and to restore a sense of national pride and discipline. Its followers, the Black Shirts, were known for their immaculate uniforms, their dramatic rallies, and their cult-like devotion to their leader. Diana was not just an observer. She was a key architect of the BUF's public image, using her society connections and her own money to fund the movement and lend it a veneer of aristocratic respectability. But beneath the slick propaganda and the promises of national rebirth, there was a dark and violent reality. The BUF's primary tool was intimidation. Black-shirt stewards would brutally beat up hecklers and anti-fascist protesters at their rallies. The movement's rhetoric became increasingly and overtly anti-Semitic, blaming Jewish financiers for Britain's economic problems and Jewish communists for social unrest. The turning point for the BUF came in June 1934 at a massive rally at the Olympia Exhibition Hall in London. It was meant to be the movement's great triumph, a spectacle of power and popularity. Over 12,000 people attended. The hall was draped in fascist banners, bathed in theatrical spotlights. Mosley, a lone figure on a vast stage, delivered a thunderous speech. But as anti-fascist protesters in the crowd began to heckle, the rally descended into a scene of sickening brutality. The Black Shirts, using knuckle dusters and rubber truncheons, dragged the protesters out and beat them mercilessly in the corridors. Several mainstream politicians who were present left in disgust, and the press reports the next day were filled with horror. The Olympia rally shocked the conscience of the nation. It revealed the thuggish, violent heart of British fascism. And from that moment on, the BUF was pushed firmly to the political fringe, seen not as a serious political alternative, but as a dangerous and un-British menace. For Diana, however, the violence at Olympia did not weaken her conviction, it strengthened it. She saw the anti-fascist protesters as communist thugs who deserved what they got. She saw the public outcry as proof that the establishment was determined to crush Mosley's movement by any means necessary. Her belief in the cause and in the man became more fanatical, more absolute. Her immersion in the ideology now took her beyond Britain to the very heart of European fascism, Nazi Germany. Accompanied by her sister Unity, who had developed her own obsessive hero-worshipping fixation on Adolf Hitler, Diana traveled to Germany for the 1933 Nuremberg rally. She was mesmerized by the spectacle, the torchlight parades, the masked banners, the almost religious fervor of the crowds, and she was determined to meet the man at the center of it all. Through a combination of persistence and connections, Diana and Unity were eventually introduced to Adolf Hitler. The German dictator was completely charmed by these two beautiful, blonde, and openly admiring English aristocrats. They became favored members of his inner circle. Diana, in particular, formed a close and disturbing bond with him. He was a frequent guest at her apartment in Munich, and she became a regular at his private dinners and opera visits. She was captivated by what she described as his extraordinary charm and his mesmerizing eyes. She saw him not as a brutal dictator, but as a visionary leader who had rescued his country from chaos. She was either blind to or willfully ignorant of the terror and persecution that his regime was already inflicting upon Jews, communists, and other perceived enemies of the state. This relationship culminated in the single most damning event of Diana's life. In October 1936, after years of waiting, she and Oswald Mosley were finally married. The ceremony was not held in a church in England. It was held in secret in Germany, in a location that was a profound and chilling political statement: the drawing room of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda. The ceremony was small, intimate, and attended by just a handful of guests. The guest of honor, the man who looked on as they exchanged their vows, was Adolf Hitler himself. He presented the couple with a silver-framed signed photograph of himself as a wedding gift. This was the moment of no return. This was the moment Diana's personal devotion to Mosley and her ideological commitment to fascism fused completely. Her marriage was no longer just a personal affair. It was a political alliance, consecrated in the home of a master propagandist and blessed by one of the most evil men in human history. The beautiful English swan was no longer just swimming in the mud. She was now at the very center of its darkest, most toxic source. The world was sliding towards war, and Diana Mitford had chosen her side. After their secret wedding in 1936, Diana did not retreat into seclusion, but increasingly traveled between Britain and Germany, maintaining close personal ties with Hitler and other high-ranking Nazi officials. She and her husband sought to build influence in Britain with ambitions to create a media empire. They planned to set up a commercial radio station both to make a profit and to broadcast pro-Nazi propaganda. However, when World War II broke out in September 1939, all their ambitious plans collapsed. This secret marriage in the heart of the Nazi regime was not just a personal union. It was a political consecration. It was the moment her devotion to Oswald Mosley and her commitment to fascism fused into a single unbreakable whole. For the next 3 years, as the world slid inexorably towards war, Diana would move through the highest echelons of Nazi power, not as a casual visitor, but as a cherished friend of the Führer himself. She was no longer just an admirer of the new Germany. She was now, through this intimate ceremony, a welcomed member of its inner sanctum. This was a period of extraordinary and deeply disturbing intimacy. Diana and Unity became fixtures in Hitler's private circle. They were frequent guests at his apartment in Munich, at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, and at his alpine retreat, the Berghof. Diana, with her cool intelligence and fluent German, and Unity, with her obsessive, almost religious adoration, represented something irresistible to Hitler. They were beautiful, blonde specimens of the British aristocracy he so admired, living proof that his ideas had appeal among the very class he hoped to either co-opt or destroy. They were a priceless propaganda coup. Diana's relationship with Hitler was complex. She consistently described him in her memoirs and interviews not as a ranting demagogue, but as a man of extraordinary charm, with mesmerizing eyes, who was modest, well-mannered, and surprisingly knowledgeable about art and architecture. They would discuss Wagner's operas, the nuances of European politics, and their shared vision for an Anglo-German alliance that would dominate the world. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Diana's story, her ability to compartmentalize. She was able to engage with the man, the charming host, the political visionary, and completely ignore, or willfully blind herself to, the monstrous reality of his regime. While she was being entertained by Hitler, the machinery of Nazi terror was already in full motion. The Gestapo was crushing all political dissent. The Nuremberg laws had stripped German Jews of their citizenship and their rights. The first concentration camps like Dachau were already in operation, filled with political prisoners. The state-sponsored persecution was not a secret. It was a public and brutal reality. Yet Diana seemed to see none of it, or rather, she chose not to see it. Her focus was fixed on the grand, abstract ideal of fascism, the promise of order, strength, and national rebirth. The human cost of that ideal, the real-world consequences of the hatred being unleashed on the streets of Germany, remained a blurry, irrelevant detail in the background of her grand historical drama. Her sister Unity's fanaticism was even more extreme and far less intellectual. While Diana's admiration was filtered through a political lens, Unity's was a pure, adolescent obsession. She was a groupie for a genocidal dictator. She would follow Hitler around Munich, sitting for hours in the Osteria Bavaria, his favorite restaurant, just hoping for a glimpse. When he finally noticed her and invited her to his table, she became his most devoted acolyte. She was openly and virulently anti-Semitic, once writing a letter to a German newspaper proclaiming her hatred of the Jews. Unity's tragic, unbalanced devotion served as a stark, almost cartoonish mirror to Diana's more calculated and intellectually grounded commitment. They were two sides of the same coin of aristocratic fanaticism, and their story would end in tragedy. Diana was not content to be merely a charming guest in Hitler's court. Fueled by her absolute conviction in the fascist cause, she began to see herself as a political actor, an unofficial ambassador who could help forge the Anglo-German alliance that both she and Hitler dreamed of. She used her unique access to carry messages and impressions back and forth, becoming a kind of go-between, walking a perilous tightrope between political idealism and what many would come to see as outright treason. Her activities did not go unnoticed by the British government. Declassified files from Britain's Domestic Intelligence Service, MI5, reveal that they were watching her with growing alarm. The files are filled with reports from informants tracking her movements and her meetings. One stark assessment from 1940 concluded that Diana was far cleverer and more dangerous than her husband and will stick at nothing to achieve her ambitions. The British state did not see her as a naive society beauty who had fallen for the wrong man. They saw her as a dedicated, intelligent, and potentially treacherous political operative. Their fears were not unfounded. The most damning evidence of Diana's active collaboration came to light years later. In the winter of 1938, with war clouds gathering, Diana traveled to Germany with a secret and audacious purpose. She had a private meeting with Hitler, and the subject was money. Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists was struggling financially. Diana, in this private audience, directly asked the Führer if he would be willing to secretly fund the BUF. Specifically, she discussed a plan for the Nazi government to provide the money to launch a commercial radio station in Britain that would broadcast pro-fascist and pro-German propaganda, bypassing the BBC. Hitler was enthusiastic about the idea. This was not a vague conversation, it was a concrete proposal for a hostile foreign power to secretly finance a propaganda machine on British soil. The plan ultimately fell through due to the outbreak of war, but the intention was clear. This act took Diana far beyond the realm of a mere sympathizer. It was a conscious attempt to collude with a foreign power against the interests of her own country. She was actively soliciting funds from a regime that was, at that very moment, preparing to launch a war that would kill hundreds of thousands of her countrymen. As 1939 dawned, Diana and Mosley, along with their small band of followers, became increasingly isolated in Britain. They continued to campaign furiously for peace, but their version of peace was a capitulation to Hitler's demands, an acceptance of Nazi domination of Europe. They held Mein Britain's business rallies, arguing that a war with Germany would be a catastrophic fratricidal conflict that would only benefit what they vaguely termed international financiers, a common anti-Semitic dog whistle. To the vast majority of the British public, who were now steeling themselves for the inevitable conflict, the Mosleys' campaign was seen as cowardly, treacherous, and deeply unpatriotic. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war on Germany. For Diana, it was the ultimate catastrophe, the failure of everything she had worked for. The news had an immediate and tragic impact on her family. Her sister Unity, who was in Munich, was so devastated by the idea of the two countries she loved going to war that she took a pistol she had been given by Hitler for self-protection, went to the city's English garden, and shot herself in the head. Miraculously, she survived, but the bullet lodged in her brain, leaving her severely and permanently brain damaged. Hitler himself visited her in the hospital and arranged for her safe passage back to England. It was Diana who had to travel to Germany to retrieve her broken sister, a terrible personal consequence of the global conflagration they had so eagerly courted. The first few months of the war were a strange, tense period known as the Phony War. But in the spring of 1940, the Phony War ended with a terrifying bang. Hitler's armies blitzkrieged across Europe, conquering Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and most catastrophically, France. Britain now stood alone, facing the imminent threat of a Nazi invasion. The nation was gripped by a fifth column panic, a deep-seated fear of spies, saboteurs, and traitors working from within to aid the German war machine. In this climate of fear and desperation, Winston Churchill's new government decided it could no longer tolerate the presence of a well-organized pro-Nazi movement on British soil. Invoking a wartime emergency power called Defense Regulation 18B, the government began rounding up thousands of suspected fascist sympathizers and enemy aliens, imprisoning them without trial. Oswald Mosley was one of the first to be arrested, taken away in May 1940 and imprisoned in Brixton Prison. For a few weeks, Diana remained at their home with her two young sons with Mosley, Alexander, and the newborn Max, who was just 9 weeks old. She perhaps believed that, as a mother with a new baby, she would be spared. She was wrong. On a June morning, the police arrived at their home. Diana was arrested. The scene was one of quiet domestic horror. She was given a few moments to say goodbye to her children and to give instructions to the nanny about feeding her infant son. Then she was escorted out to a waiting car. Lady Mosley, the celebrated beauty, the society queen, was now officially designated prisoner, 9,923, an enemy of the state. She was taken to Holloway Prison, a grim, forbidding Victorian institution in North London, a world of clanging iron doors, echoing corridors, and the smell of disinfectant. For a woman accustomed to every luxury, the shock of imprisonment must have been profound. Her first cell was filthy, with a bed crawling with bugs. She was placed in solitary confinement, allowed out for only 1 hour of exercise a day. Yet in her memoirs and letters, Diana describes her experience not with self-pity, but with a kind of cold aristocratic stoicism. She saw herself not as a criminal, but as a political prisoner, a martyr for a cause she still believed in. She wrote, "One could have a bath once a week. The water was tepid and shallow, but it was a bath. It was a spirit of defiant endurance." She spent her time reading voraciously, Goethe, Shakespeare, history books, and teaching herself Italian. After a year, conditions improved. Mosley was transferred from Brixton, and he and Diana were interned together in a small 2-story house within the prison walls. Here, they established a strange, surreal domestic routine. They were allowed to cook their own meals, to receive books and parcels, and to cultivate a small patch of land. Diana threw herself into gardening with a fierce dedication, growing vegetables and flowers, creating a small pocket of order and beauty in the midst of their confinement. They read, they wrote, they debated politics. Their conviction, far from being broken by the prison walls, was only hardened. Their shared suffering intensified their bond and reinforced their belief that they were the victims of a terrible injustice, persecuted by a weak and frightened establishment. For over 3 years they remained imprisoned, while outside the Battle of Britain raged, the Blitz rained down on London, and millions perished in a world war that they had, in their own way, encouraged. In November 1943, on the advice of doctors who feared for Mosley's deteriorating health, the government made the decision to release them. The public outcry was enormous. Thousands protested in the streets. Newspapers ran furious editorials. The idea that these two reviled figures, the leaders of British fascism, would be released while the war was still being fought was an outrage to a nation that had sacrificed so much. The Mosleys were not freed. They were released into a form of house arrest, shunned by almost everyone, pariahs in their own country. The war would eventually end, but for Diana Mosley, the verdict of history had been delivered. She would spend the rest of her very long life living in its shadow. After the war, when the crimes of Nazi Germany were exposed, the Mosleys became hated figures in the British public. They decided to leave England and spent most of the rest of their lives in France. There, Oswald Mosley tried to found a new political movement with the idea of Europe as a nation, but failed. Meanwhile, Diana became a writer, editing the European magazine and writing several books, including the famous memoir, A Life of Contrasts. It is worth noting that throughout her life she never expressed regret about her political choices or her relationship with Hitler. Even in an interview late in her life, she coldly asserted, "I have no regrets." When Diana and Oswald Mosley were released from Holloway prison in November 1943, they were freed into a nation that despised them. The public outcry was enormous. They were seen not as political prisoners, but as traitors who had been spared the justice they deserved, while the sons of ordinary Britons were still dying on the battlefields of Europe. For the remainder of the war, they lived under house arrest, shunned by almost everyone. The end of the war, in 1945, did not bring absolution. As the full, unimaginable horror of the Holocaust was revealed to the world, the gas chambers, the death camps, the systematic slaughter of 6 million Jews, the name Mosley became synonymous with the evil that Britain had fought so hard to defeat. The England they had once known, a world where their names commanded respect and their presence was courted, was gone forever. They were pariahs, and so, like so many disgraced figures before them, they chose exile. After a brief, difficult period living in Ireland, they made the decision in 1951 to leave the British Isles for good. They settled in France, eventually buying a magnificent yet secluded 18th century mansion called the Temple de la Gloire, near Orsay, just outside Paris. The name itself, the Temple of Glory, was a typically defiant statement. Here, in this beautiful isolated bubble, they set about meticulously recreating a world on their own terms. It was a court in exile. Diana, ever the formidable hostess, once again made their home a magnet for a curious and eclectic mix of people. Their salon became a stopping point for a strange constellation of writers, artists, intellectuals, and political figures, many of whom were, like the Mosleys, outsiders or rebels in their own right. Their circle included the controversial American poet Ezra Pound, who had been charged with treason for his pro-fascist broadcasts in Italy during the war. It included French writers and aristocrats who harbored their own right-wing sympathies. And, most famously, it included their neighbors and close friends, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The friendship between the former King of England, who himself had been accused of Nazi sympathies, and Britain's most notorious fascist leader was a source of endless fascination and suspicion. It was a friendship of the shunned, a bond between two men who felt they had been betrayed and misunderstood by the British establishment. In this self-contained world, surrounded by sympathetic friends and the beautiful objects she collected, Diana could maintain the fiction that she was not a disgraced figure but a misunderstood idealist, a queen in a kingdom of her own making. In this new life, Diana found a new vocation, one that allowed her to continue to fight for her beliefs and to shape her own narrative. She became a writer and an editor. For several years, she edited a political journal called The European, a high-minded publication that served as a platform for Oswald Mosley's post-war political idea, Europe, a Nation. This was a vision of a united authoritarian European state, a concept that was, in its own way, a continuation of his fascist principles, stripped of the swastikas and the black shirts, but retaining the core belief in a strong, centrally controlled anti-democratic power structure. But it was as a memoirist and biographer that Diana truly found her voice. She wrote several books, all of them characterized by an elegant, witty, and deceptively charming prose style. Her most famous work, her autobiography, A Life of Contrasts, was published in 1977. It is a masterpiece of the genre, but it is also a masterpiece of self-justification. The book is filled with dazzling anecdotes about the Mitford family, witty portraits of the famous people she knew, and a compelling narrative of her dramatic life. But it is what the book doesn't say that is most revealing. When dealing with her political past, Diana's prose becomes a masterclass in evasion, minimization, and deflection. She writes of Hitler's hypnotic charm and good manners, but remains utterly silent on his monstrous crimes. She describes her political activities as a noble, idealistic quest for peace, never acknowledging that the peace she sought was on Hitler's terms. She expresses no regret, no remorse, no sense of moral responsibility for her choices. The book is not an apology. It is a defense, a carefully constructed argument for her own innocence, written with all the skill and charm she had once used to captivate a room. She also wrote a biography of her friend, the Duchess of Windsor, another famously controversial woman who had lived a life of exile after a great scandal. It is easy to see why Diana was drawn to her story. In Wallis Simpson, she saw a fellow rebel, another woman who had defied the British establishment and had been punished for it. Her writing was a way of controlling her own legacy, of presenting her life not as a story of terrible moral error, but as a courageous stand against a stuffy and hypocritical world. The pen was not just a tool for storytelling, it was her final, most elegant shield. For decades after the war, Diana lived a quiet, secluded life, protected by the walls of her French estate and the loyalty of her chosen circle. But in her old age, she agreed to a series of television and radio interviews that catapulted her back into the public consciousness and ignited a firestorm of fresh controversy. The world had changed. A new generation had grown up with the full documented horror of the Holocaust as a central fact of modern history. They were not prepared for what they were about to hear. In a series of now infamous interviews, including a celebrated appearance on the BBC's Desert Island Discs in 1989, an elderly Diana faced questions about her past. The performance was breathtaking. She was poised, charming, witty, intelligent, and utterly, chillingly unrepentant. When asked about her admiration for Hitler, she would praise his charisma and his political achievements, brushing aside his crimes as historical footnotes. When confronted directly with the fact of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, her responses were a shocking display of denial and moral evasion. "I'm sure it was 6 million, she once said with a dismissive air. "I live in a country where a great many people don't believe it. I can't believe it." On another occasion, she stated simply, one can't regret things." These interviews were a national sensation. They revealed to a modern audience a woman whose moral compass seemed entirely broken, a person for whom personal loyalty and ideological aesthetics trumped any recognition of unimaginable human suffering. The charm and intelligence that had once been so seductive now seemed monstrous, a beautiful facade for a hollowed-out soul. The public outrage was immense. To her critics, she was not a misunderstood idealist. She was an unrepentant Nazi sympathizer, using her still considerable charm to poison the historical record. This unbridgeable moral gulf was mirrored within her own family. Her sister Jessica, Decca, the committed communist, had been her ideological opposite her entire life. After Diana's wartime imprisonment, they were permanently estranged. Decca, who had fought against fascism in the Spanish Civil War, saw her sister's beliefs as an unforgivable evil. In her own witty, scathing memoirs, she wrote of her fascist sisters with a mixture of familial affection and absolute political condemnation. The lifelong schism between Diana the fascist and Decca the communist became a poignant microcosm of the great ideological wars of the 20th century, a family tragedy played out on the stage of world history. Diana Mosley lived a very long life. After Oswald Mosley's death in 1980, she remained in Paris, a living, breathing monument to a discredited past. She died there during the intense heat wave of 2003, at the age of 93. But the questions surrounding her life, her choices, and her unrepentant convictions continue to echo, shaping our understanding of history, celebrity, and the human capacity for both brilliance and profound moral blindness. Her story stands as a powerful, unsettling reminder of the seductive power of extremist ideologies. It shows us how even intelligent, privileged, and charismatic individuals can be drawn into movements that promise order, purpose, and a sense of belonging, often at the cost of humanity. In an age where populist movements and radical ideologies are again on the rise, Diana's life serves as a stark historical parallel, urging us to examine the conditions, social, economic, and psychological, that allow such ideas to flourish, even among the seemingly untouchable elite. Her unwavering stance on her past forces us to confront the enduring challenge of historical accountability. Her refusal to acknowledge the full scale of Nazi atrocities, her consistent downplaying of the Holocaust, remains a deeply troubling aspect of her legacy. It highlights the insidious nature of historical revisionism and the difficulty of confronting uncomfortable truths, especially for those who were complicit. Her charm, her intellect, and her elegant demeanor made her denials all the more disquieting, demonstrating how the packaging of an argument can sometimes obscure the toxicity of its content. The story of Diana Mitford is not one of easy answers or simple villains. It is a complex tapestry woven with threads of privilege, intellect, love, betrayal, and unshakable conviction. She was a woman of extraordinary presence, a luminous beauty who captivated some of the most powerful and dangerous men of her era. But her choices, driven by a fierce loyalty and a profound ideological certainty, cast a long, dark shadow that no amount of charm or intellect could erase. In the end, we return to Truman Capote's brilliant observation. Diana proves that swans can swim in political mud. The swan was her beauty, her aristocratic grace, her formidable intelligence. It was the exquisite surface that captivated the world. The mud was the hateful, violent, and racist ideology she chose to embrace. But unlike a real swan, which might be dirtied by the mire, Diana seemed to treat the mud as her natural element. Her conviction was so total, her self-belief so absolute, that she emerged in her own eyes completely unblemished, leaving the rest of us to gaze in horrified wonder at the beautiful, chilling spectacle. Her life stands as a testament to the fact that history is rarely black and white, but a canvas painted in shades of gray, and a permanent reminder that the most dangerous ideas can often come in the most beautiful packages.